Hey guys, tonight we begin with the mystery of what might be the most awkward and oddly fascinating question in all of paleoanthropology. What was sex really like for Neanderthals? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You awaken to the sound of wind dragging frost across stone. The sun hasn't yet climbed above the distant ridge, and your breath rises in small puffs, visible even inside the cave. You're a Neanderthal, short, broad, strong, and built like someone who wins every wrestling match simply by standing still. Your world is cold, not in a poetic, emotionally distant way, literally cold. Glacial winds sweep through the steppe, and snow clings to every crevice. You wear the hide of a reindeer, not for fashion, but because it was either that or freeze your extremely important anatomy off. You didn't tan the hide yourself, of course. That was your mate's job, and they're better at not making everything smell like wet goat. Your hands are calloused from shaping flint, your knees ache from squatting over fire pits, and your hair? It's somewhere between mossy helmet and feral dog caught in a windstorm. Grooming is done with bone combs and occasional help from bored group members who may or may not be picking lice for fun. Your tribe is small. A dozen or so individuals, some old, some younger. You know them all by scent before sight. There's no written language, no surnames, and certainly no secrets. Everyone hears everything, even the moments you wish were private. You live in a shallow cave that's dark, smoky, and damp. Not the seductive kind of dark, just the hope that mold isn't sentient yet kind. The hearth is the heart of it all. Food is shared, stories are gestured more than told, and sleeping arrangements are mostly dictated by who doesn't snore like a dying aurochs. Sex, in this world, isn't casual, though it might seem that way from the outside. It's survival, continuation, a chance to pass on your robust skull structure and excellent cold weather lungs. But it's also bound by a kind of closeness born from shared hardship. You don't date. You form bonds through firewood collection, meat sharing, and occasionally not dying during a hunt. You don't think of yourself as primitive. This is just life. And if it includes the occasional stolen moment behind a mammoth hide curtain, while others pretend not to notice, well, that's as intimate as it gets in the Pleistocene. Romance for you begins with proximity to warmth, and not just metaphorically. In your world, snuggling is less of a flirtation and more of a survival imperative. If you're not pressed against at least two other hairy bodies by nightfall, you're either incredibly brave or about to become a stylish Neanderthal popsicle. Forget candlelit dinners, the real aphrodisiac. A fire that actually stays lit through a snowstorm, and someone who doesn't hoard all the dried marrow scraps. Swoon. There's no will they, won't they. It's more like, will they share their mammoth fur? Yes? Then they're clearly into you. You don't have words for love, but you do have gestures. A gifted fox tooth, a perfectly cracked marrow bone, or the rare sharing of a dry sleeping spot. These are declarations of deep affection. You once saw someone give away the good part of a hair. It was practically a marriage proposal. Bathing isn't really a thing, but if someone scrapes the grime off your back with a flint scraper while humming what might be a tune, you're halfway to intimacy. The smell of your mate isn't something to hide. It's a reassuring blend of smoke, sweat, and crushed roots. Basically the prehistoric equivalent of cologne, if cologne came with bits of bark in it. The mating ritual begins around the fire, subtly. A glance, a grunt, an offered scrap of meat. You inch closer, testing the waters, or, rather, the furs. If they don't scoot away or throw a rock, you're making progress. There are no long conversations, no courtship dances, unless you count the awkward shuffle you do when trying to sit close without knocking over the cooking stone. Yet somehow, it works. You've survived a winter together, and in your world, that's a commitment stronger than any spoken vow. And so you lie together, 2 steaming lumps in a sea of fur and bone, listening to the fire pop and someone in the back of the cave snore like a dying bear. It's not glamorous, but in the Ice Age, it's downright romantic. Love, for you, begins and ends with shared warmth, a steady fire, and the unspoken agreement not to steal the last piece of roasted marrow. Your tribe consists of about 12 individuals, give or take whoever didn't fall into a ravine this month. It's not a bustling metropolis. It's more like an uncomfortable family reunion that never ends. You don't swipe left or right. You just look across the fire and realize, again, that your only viable partner is the one who bit you last week over a rabbit thigh. This is the brutal math of prehistoric romance. Fewer people, fewer choices, higher chance your crush is also your second cousin. There's no shame in it, at least not yet. The concept of genetic diversity hasn't been invented, but even your instincts seem to know that repeating the same faces too many times might lead to some undesirable results. Which is why, when a neighbouring band visits during the warmer months, things suddenly get a little more flirtatious. You clean yourself up, which means scraping some dried gunk off your leg and shaking the lice out of your furs. You watch the visitors arrive with a level of interest usually reserved for mammoth sightings, a stranger with unfamiliar smells, and possibly fewer visible injuries. It's practically erotic. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Competition is fierce. One look, one gesture, one slightly less terrifying facial expression can make the difference between mate and awkward fireside avoidance for the next 3 winters. Back in your own group, the options are cozy. You know everyone's habits. Who steals meat? Who snorts while sleeping? Who can't make fire without panicking? Love in a small tribe is less about sparks flying and more about managing low expectations. If someone doesn't actively insult your cooking or throw rocks when annoyed, they're a keeper. That being said, relationships form, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of routine, and sometimes, in the rarest of cases, because someone makes you laugh by mimicking a dying cave lion. It's the little things. Still, mating within such a tight circle comes with complications. Rivalries, jealousies, confusion over who's bonded with whom, especially when everyone sleeps in a pile and names are just different grunts. In a world this small, love isn't blind. It's just nearsighted and incredibly forgiving. You don't have a language. Not really. Not in the let's talk it out kind of way. You've got grunts, hand signals, facial twitches, and one very expressive eyebrow that somehow means both food and back off. It's a communication style built less on grammar and more on surviving long enough to grunt again tomorrow. Romance, as you might guess, is therefore an interpretive dance of vague noises and hopeful eye contact. You don't flirt with words, you flirt with posture. A subtle lean toward the fire, an offering of a slightly less burnt tuber, or a grunt pitched a little lower than usual. Think less Shakespearean sonnet, more enthusiastic throat clearing. You've tried to express feelings before, a thoughtful gift of moss, a shoulder pat that didn't accidentally dislocate anything, but emotions are hard to articulate when your vocabulary includes 5 vocalizations, one of which is reserved exclusively for falling rocks. Still, your tribe gets it. Somehow, amidst the roaring wind and snapping bones, they understand each other. One sharp grunt means danger. A soft cooing sound means you're trying to soothe a baby, or at least pretending it's not yours. And a long, low groan while staring at someone usually translates to, "I find you acceptable in this dim, smoke-filled light." Arguments happen too, but they're fast and loud. A burst of flailing arms and intense glares. The upside is that once someone throws a stick, the conversation ends. Resolution by projectile. Surprisingly effective. But in this world of limited words, emotions still run deep. When your mate looks at you after a shared kill, blood on both your hands, soot on your face, and that unmistakable expression that says, "You didn't completely ruin this hunt," that's affection. Maybe even love. Children learn by mimicking, not listening. You once watched a toddler try to seduce a rock with a leaf because they saw the grown-ups do it. It was oddly convincing. So yes, You live without complex language. But you make do with glances, grunts, and the occasional playful nudge that doesn't end in injury. You don't need flowery speech to find connection. Just warmth, shared food, and the mutual understanding that if anyone takes your mammoth rib, they're sleeping outside. You're holding a sharp rock. That's not a metaphor. It's literally a rock you've been sharpening all morning, with intense focus and vague sexual frustration. In your world, a well-shaped flint blade is not just a survival tool. It's an extension of your personality. Some say romance is dead. You say romance is shaped like a pointy scraper and stained with mammoth grease. When it comes to impressing a potential mate, tools are your flowers and poems. A hand axe with a good grip. That's seductive. A fire starter that only takes 3 strikes. Irresistible. You once saw someone craft a bone awl so delicately that it caused a minor love triangle and at least one minor stabbing. But it's not just the tools, it's what you do with them. Like carve designs into your arms with ochre and bone shards. No one told you to do this, and there's no gallery to showcase your work. You just know that if you don't have at least 3 strange patterns on your chest, you're basically invisible in mating season. These tattoos, assuming we can call them that without offending modern tattoo artists, don't really have meanings, or if they do, everyone forgot. Maybe they once represented bravery, lineage, or successful hunts. Now they mostly mean, don't stab me, I'm cool. Of course, with all this artistry and expression comes tension. Not everything is peaceful in the cave of love. If someone uses your favorite scraping stone without asking, you may experience a rage not seen since the last hyena raid. Jealousy runs deep, especially when the same 3 eligible adults keep making slightly too long eye contact around the fire. That's when things get awkward. Grunting becomes sharper. Elbows become pointier. You start flint-napping louder than necessary. Your rival might casually toss an extra-large spearhead into the pile, a silent power move that says, "I killed a boar. What did you do today?" And yet, somehow, it works. Amidst the clashing tools, ochre smears, and passive-aggressive bone carvings, relationships emerge. Because nothing says, "I'm into you," like gifting someone a well-balanced hand axe and not immediately clubbing them with it. Love, in the time of Neanderthals, is loud, sharp-edged, and deeply practical. So, you've survived the hunt, shared your mammoth marrow, and exchanged vaguely romantic grunts by firelight. One thing leads to another, mostly because there are no doors in your cave. And now you're lying next to your mate on a mossy pile that's 70% warmth, 30% insects, and 100% romantic. But what now? There's no Netflix, no deep philosophical post-lovemaking chat. Just your breath visible in the cold air and the soothing drip-drip of water from a nearby stalactite. You roll over, making just enough noise to signal you're not asleep. Your mate responds with a grunt that could mean contentment, regret, or there's something crawling on me again. It's hard to tell. You attempt to initiate conversation, which consists of scratching your arm rhythmically and pointing at a rock formation that sort of looks like a bear. They nod. Emotional connection established. You both settle into silence, not because you're awkward, but because you don't have the linguistic tools to make it awkward. There's comfort in that. No overthinking, no analyzing tone, no accidentally calling someone the name of your previous cave crush. You just exist. Together. Warm and possibly covered in shared lice. Occasionally your mate might reach over and pat your thigh with the tenderness of someone who didn't actively try to stab you today. That's affection. Or they'll hand you a slightly less filthy piece of hide to wrap around your shoulders. That's love. Or at least their way of saying, "You snore, but you have nice hair." And then comes the snoring. Loud, unfiltered, and deeply primal. A lullaby of gurgles and wheezes echoing off the cave walls. You don't mind. It's familiar. Like the sound of mammoths stomping in the distance, or your neighbour choking on bone fragments. Pillow talk, in your world, isn't about words. It's about shared warmth, shared space, and the subtle art of not rolling too far into the cold while still maintaining plausible intimacy. And if you wake up tomorrow and they haven't stolen your best fur or wandered off with your flint blade, That's a relationship milestone. Your mate is pregnant. Again. You figured something was up when she hurled a pine cone at you for breathing too loudly. Also, she's been hoarding berries like a winter bear and throwing up every time someone roasts lizard near the fire. Classic signs. Pregnancy in the Ice Age isn't exactly a glowing miracle. It's more of a survival lottery with swollen ankles and unpredictable mood swings that could escalate to projectile bone clubs. There are no midwives, no prenatal herbs, and no concept of taking it easy. Just a heavily pregnant woman still expected to gather firewood and possibly club a hyena if it gets too nosy. You, of course, do your part. You offer her the juiciest grubs. You grunt supportively. You carve a vaguely humanoid figure into a stick and say, "For baby." She stares at it like she's deciding whether to be touched or annoyed. Probably both. The tribe has seen it all before. Babies are always arriving, some healthy, some not. Everyone keeps their expectations low and their spare pelts ready. A new life is a cause for celebration, yes, but also for anxious glances at dwindling food piles. More mouths, less mammoth. The elders tell you this is natural. One old woman points to her 10 children and says something that may translate to, "They all survived," or "They all disappeared in the river." Hard to tell with her toothless mumbling. Your mate sleeps more now, wrapped in layers of hide like a grumpy burrito. You keep watch, shooing away anyone who gets too close. Especially that one cousin who still thinks flirting means showing off his squirrel skull collection. You worry, of course. The last birth wasn't easy. The healer used a mix of moss, humming, and hopeful squinting. But you're optimistic this time. Maybe it's the way your mate still sharpens her spear daily, or the fact that she hasn't thrown it at you in a week. And when she places your hand on her belly, swollen, warm, and unmistakably kicking, you feel something rare. Not just fear, not just survival, but the strange, tender hope that this tiny, kicking creature might outlive you both. Even if it does inherit your hairline, you're minding your own business, maybe sharpening a spear, maybe lovingly rearranging your flint collection when they show up. Tall, slender, suspiciously smooth foreheads, less brow ridge, weirdly artistic. These newcomers call themselves Homo sapiens, and they walk like they invented walking. At first, you don't know what to make of them. They smell different. Not bad, just intentional. Like they rubbed berries on themselves on purpose. One of them draws something on a cave wall that actually looks like an animal. You're torn between awe and rage. You've spent years scratching mammoth-shaped blobs into stone, and here comes Captain Thin Nose sketching like he's on prehistoric Pinterest. The sapiens have tools too, but they're delicate. Bone needles, fishing hooks, jewelry made from snail shells. You briefly wonder if one of them is single. Then you remember they also brought weird rituals, loud songs, and a tendency to domesticate everything, including you if you're not careful. Their language? Faster, full of vowels, and somehow condescending even when they're just asking for berries. One of them tries to mime a greeting. You think they're choking on a beetle and hit them on the back. They stop talking to you after that. And then, inevitably, the flirting begins. The sapiens eye your tribe like you're a menu at a meat market. Some of your kin look back. After all, new blood is new blood. And those shell necklaces? Kinda hot. You suddenly feel deeply insecure about your own fur loincloth and lack of symmetrical tattoos. Mating across species lines becomes a thing. No one talks about it openly, but the cave next door has been suspiciously giggly lately, and a lot of ochre has gone missing. You don't hate them. Not exactly. But you can feel the change. They have strange tools, bigger groups, a tendency to build, organize, and complain about things like grain. You, on the other hand, still hunt, grunt, and survive. Still, you notice your mate watching them. Their fire burns hotter. Their cave doesn't smell like damp bear. And they have this unsettling habit of smiling with their teeth. It's the beginning of the end. But you don't know that yet. You just know that one of them offered you cooked fish, and it was actually kind of good. You didn't even know you were capable of jealousy until one of the Homo sapiens gave your mate a shell bracelet with a polished center. Suddenly something inside you snapped. Not a bone, this time, but something deeper. You don't have a word for it, but it makes you want to growl, throw a rock, and mark your territory with extra urine. Your mate giggled at him. He's got smaller brow ridges, sure, and his pelt looks like it was washed in a stream that doesn't double as a urinal. But still. Giggling, you try to act cool. You casually sharpen your spear near them for 6 hours. You lift a heavy mammoth skull and flex unnecessarily. You cough loudly every time he speaks. Unfortunately, you have the social subtlety of a warthog with sunstroke. This strange new emotion, let's call it ugh feeling, spreads fast. One of your cave cousins throws a rabbit carcass at his mate after she compliments a sapien stone bead necklace. Another Neanderthal breaks a perfectly good spear over jealousy-fueled rage, then cries when he realizes he has to recarve it. No one taught you how to deal with this. Your ancestors never had to compete with brainy, art-loving, smooth-talking cousins from the south. Back then, courtship was simple. Share meat, don't club each other, raise offspring until they can run from wolves. Now it's all mixed signals. Your mate smiles at you. But did she smile more at the guy who knows how to make fire without flint? You pat her head affectionately, and she recoils. Not because of jealousy, but because your hands still smell like fermented badger. One night you catch her and the sapien laughing at something near the fire. You ask what's so funny. She tries to explain. You don't understand. It stings worse than stepping on sharp bone. That's when it hits you. Homo sapiens invented jokes, and with them, jealousy. So, you storm off, sit on your rock, and sulk dramatically. It's not productive, but it feels right. You don't know it, but you've just participated in the first prehistoric emotional spiral. Congratulations. You've officially unlocked an exclusive feature of sentient life. Emotional torment. Now go punch a tree and pretend it helped. You used to think you looked good. Thick brow ridge, powerful jaw, a fur pelt that screamed, "I killed this myself." But that was before the Homo sapiens brought style to the valley. Suddenly, it's not enough to wear mammoth skin. Now it has to be draped. Now beads matter. Now everyone's asking if your leggings are sable or mud-dyed. And you're like, what's mud-dyed? While standing there wearing a squirrel pelt tied with sinew. The younger Neanderthals, traitors, are into it. One of them is braiding his hair with bird bones. Another shows up with face paint made from crushed berries and announces, "This shade is called Intimidated Elk." You hate how good it looks. You try to keep up. You smear some ash under your eyes, thinking it gives a mysterious hunter vibe. Instead, it gives, "I fought a fire and lost." Your mate sighs and helps you wash it off with a handful of moss. It is not a proud moment. And the sapiens? They strut like peacocks. One of them wears a cape made from stitched-together rodent hides and walks like he's the shaman of Fashion Week. The worst part. Everyone stares, in admiration. He probably doesn't even hunt. There's now an unspoken competition at every gathering. Who has the most vibrant beads? Whose furs are the cleanest? Who accessorized their club handle with decorative grooves and notches? It's exhausting. You begin to realize that fashion is no longer about warmth or function. It's about vibes. A whole cultural war is breaking out over decorative feathers. Someone actually tries to smuggle in dyed feathers from another tribe. A fight breaks out. Clubs are thrown. A necklace is snapped in slow motion. The elders grumble, but even they're not immune. One of them shows up one day wearing a feathered headdress and says, "I'm reclaiming my youth." Everyone nods solemnly. No one mentions the dead chicken it clearly came from. Eventually you give in. You add a little flair. A necklace here, a bone bracelet there. You catch your reflection in a puddle and think, maybe I don't look entirely like I rolled out of a bear den anymore. And for the first time, you understand a terrifying truth. Even in the Stone Age, appearances matter. You think courtship is about meat and grunting. And in many ways, you're not wrong. But beneath the mammoth steaks and awkward fire-gazing lies a budding complexity you never asked for. prehistoric psychology. You wake up one morning and realize you're strategizing. Should I bring her the biggest bone from the hunt, or is that too desperate? Welcome to proto-romantic anxiety, a delightful mental stew of insecurity, competitive instincts, and unspoken rules passed down through confused eyebrow twitches. You start noticing patterns. When you ignore her, she stares. When you stare, she ignores you. You think maybe she likes the mysterious type, so you pretend to be brooding. Unfortunately, this mostly just makes you look constipated. There are rituals now, not official ones, but they're emerging. A certain kind of flower gathered from the swamp that, for some reason, everyone agrees is romantic. Dancing around the fire in a particular way that signals, I'm single and have good knee joints. Gifting a shiny rock, but not too shiny, or you'll seem like you're trying too hard. Your cousin tried that once and got laughed out of the cave. He still hasn't recovered. Your tribe has no written language, but somehow there's a shared understanding of what makes someone a good mate. Strength, sure, but also emotional availability, or as emotional as one can be while still occasionally chewing on raw liver. You begin performing. Your laughs are louder. Your hunting tales more exaggerated. You pretend you weren't scared of the bear, even though you absolutely were. You sit closer to the fire so the flickering light catches your jawline just right. Subtle manipulation, Neanderthal edition. Meanwhile, you're being judged too. She watches how you treat the elders, how you share food, whether you accidentally elbowed the kid who tried to take your seat on the mammoth pelt. It's not just survival of the fittest anymore. It's survival of the slightly charismatic. At some point, you realize the line between instinct and emotion has blurred. You want her to like you, not just mate with you. You want her to laugh at your bad jokes, admire your carving skills, and maybe, just maybe, not pick the sapien with the symmetrical face. Congratulations. You're now emotionally entangled, and the Ice Age hasn't even ended yet. You didn't leave behind a cave painting. You never learned to play the bone flute. You once got your foot stuck in a badger hole and were mocked for 2 lunar cycles. And yet, somehow, your genes survive. You're not entirely sure how. Maybe it was your average charm. Maybe it was the one time you managed to kill a wild boar and didn't gloat about it for a whole week. Or maybe, just maybe, your mate saw something in you that wasn't forehead width or muscle mass. Something softer. Something like not actively drooling during courtship. Your children are small, loud, and mostly sticky. They throw bones at each other and chew on moss. One of them screams at birds, but they're alive, and they carry your brow ridge. You take a moment to realize what this means. You've passed on your instincts, your weird shoulder-to-neck ratio, your suspicious squint, and, tragically, your inability to digest mushrooms. You've made it, not as a legend but as genetic data. Somewhere in the valley, another Neanderthal didn't. He had stronger arms than you, a cooler fur vest. He once balanced 3 rocks on his head to impress a girl, but he got kicked by a reindeer and never recovered. And now, nothing. No legacy. No shrieking toddlers biting each other in his name. Survival is not glamorous. It's not about greatness. It's about not dying long enough to reproduce, and preferably doing so before being eaten by something with fangs. And you? You did that. Your mate is still by your side. She occasionally smacks you with a stick when you forget to share berries, but that's love in its purest form. You sit together by the fire one night, your cave clan sleeping in a pile behind you. You watch the stars and think, we existed, we mattered, sort of. You will never know the full impact of your DNA. That hundreds of thousands of years from now, a lab technician will spit into a tube and get a report that says 2.1% Neanderthal, likely responsible for broad nose and inability to fold fitted sheets. You don't need a monument, you are the monument. Well, you and the 47 descendants currently stealing your mammoth pelt. You don't notice it at first, just a few missing faces around the fire. A hunt that brings back less meat, a strange stillness in the trees, like the forest knows something you don't. Then the whispers start. Well, gestures really, since nobody has invented whispering yet. The sapiens are moving in, more of them, with sharper tools. taller spears, smaller jaws but bigger plans. Your tribe shrinks. Not from battle, but from something worse. Outbreeding. Your best hunters are now shacking up with smooth-chinned Homo sapiens, seduced by their symmetrical skulls and suspiciously white teeth. One even brings back a bread thing. You pretend not to care. You eat it anyway. You try to hold the tribe together, but the signs are everywhere. Fewer children look like you. The brow ridges are getting dainty. Someone builds a round hut. Someone else paints a horse with 3 legs. Standards are slipping. The old ways are fading. You and your mate sit quietly by the fire. She looks tired. Not old, just done. She used to run faster than deer. Now she watches your children, and theirs, chase each other with sticks that have been polished. You miss the rough sticks. They had character. The weather shifts. The animals migrate differently. Plants you used to gather are gone. Even the mammoths seem over it. You hear stories from the mountains. No Neanderthals left up there either. You nod. You've heard that before. One night, a sapien child calls you uncle. It's meant with affection, but it hits like a club to the chest. You realize your name will not survive. Your voice, your stories, your precise technique for cracking marrow bones, all gone. And yet, you're not angry. Just resigned. This is how it ends. Not with a war drum, but with a whimper and an awkward shared campsite. You take one last walk through the valley. Your valley. The one where you cracked your first joke. Fell in love. Taught your son to throw a spear. You crouch beside a stream and splash your face with cold water. You look up. A sapien's child stares back. Wide-eyed. Curious. His mother calls him. He runs. You vanish into memory. But your blood does not. You, a once grunting, fire-hoarding, mammoth-hunting legend, are now a data point. A fascinating mystery to modern Homo sapiens who spend more time sitting in chairs than squatting in bushes. They peer into your bones with lasers. They argue about your mating habits on the internet. They make documentaries with dramatically whispered narrations about you, even though they still can't agree if you went extinct or just merged romantically. Archaeologists brush your skull fragments like they're holding the Holy Grail. One of your molars lives in a museum display case with climate control. A single tool you chipped from flint is in someone's thesis titled Cognitive Symbolism in the Mysterian Era. You never wrote a word, and yet somehow you're published. They wonder what you ate. Mammoth stew. How you bathed. You didn't. And what your love life was like. Complicated. They map your genes in massive computers and then post about it on social media. A tech bro in California now proudly tells women at parties that he's 3% Neanderthal. You're not sure if it's helping him. Artists paint you over and over again. Sometimes you're noble and muscular, gazing into a prehistoric sunset. Other times you're portrayed like a hairy potato with arms. You never asked for this fame, but you got it anyway. Posthumously, of course. Even stranger, you're trending. In memes, in debates, in awkward dinner conversations. People fight over whether you were human enough, as if humanity were measured in credit card debt and the ability to microwave soup. They want to know if you had religion, if you believed in an afterlife, if you worried about your hairline. You, meanwhile, once spent an entire afternoon figuring out how to not die from eating a green frog. But here's the wild part. You did matter. You shaped them. You left traces in their blood, their brains, their dreams. A flicker of your defiance, your tenderness, your absurd little superstitions. It's all still rattling around in them somewhere. So if you could say one thing to your very distant, very confused descendants, maybe it would be this. You were never meant to last forever, just long enough to be remembered. You, the grunt speaker, the flint napper, the lover of mammoth marrow and occasional tree-staring contests. You are gone. And yet, not really. Your bones may be buried beneath sediment and sheep dung, but fragments of you walk the earth every day, in elbows that jut just a bit too far, in noses built for colder air. in tempers that flare over nothing more than someone eating the last piece of meat. Scientists call it genetic legacy. You'd call it stubborn survival. Modern humans carry pieces of your DNA like weird ancestral luggage, up to 2% of their genome, to be exact. That's enough to slightly affect their immune system, their sleep cycles, and apparently, their risk of depression. You were a whole mood, it turns out. You, whose language was mostly grunts and side eyes, are now spoken about in university lectures with words like hominin divergence and introgressive hybridization. You'd think they were describing a new kind of fungus. But no, they're talking about you. You who once mistook a snapping turtle for a hat. You may not have painted the Sistine Chapel, or written a sonnet, or built a skyscraper with flushable toilets, but you kissed under moonlight. You danced by firelight. You protected your young with every ounce of strength in your hairy, frost-bitten body. You tried. And that's the most human thing anyone can do. And as Homo sapiens teeters on the edge of climate catastrophe, AI confusion, and existential dread over avocado toast prices, maybe your way, simple, direct, muddy, had some advantages. Modern people like to think they've escaped nature. You never did. You were nature. You lived close to the bone, literally and metaphorically. You didn't leave behind cathedrals or symphonies, but you left behind them. And that's no small thing. Because you didn't fade entirely. You were absorbed, intertwined, immortalized. And now, as your distant descendants wonder who you were and what it meant to love, to suffer, and to die in your time, they look into the past and find the strangest thing of all, themselves. And you grin from whatever corner of prehistory still echoes, probably sitting by a fire, chewing mammoth jerky, muttering something like, "Told you we were hot." Before the sea peoples ever set sail, the eastern Mediterranean was already a glittering mosaic of kingdoms and empires. It was a world bound together by bronze, the metal that gave the age its name. From the palaces of Mycenaean Greece to the fortified cities of the Hittites in Anatolia, and from the ports of Canaan to the temples of Egypt, trade and diplomacy tied the region into a fragile but dazzling network. Ships carried copper from Cyprus, tin from as far away as Central Asia, and gold from Nubia. Merchants exchanged olive oil, wine, ivory, and textiles, while kings sent letters etched in cuneiform tablets, bargaining for brides, alliances, and military aid. But this prosperity hid cracks beneath the surface. The system that looked so stable was, in fact, precariously balanced. The great empires depended on long-distance trade for their very survival. Without tin, there could be no bronze weapons. Without grain imports, cities faced famine. When crops failed, when earthquakes shook cities, or when bandits disrupted caravans, the consequences rippled outward like shockwaves across the entire region. By the late 13th century BCE, storms of trouble gathered. Climate change and drought led to poor harvests, straining food supplies. Revolts simmered in outlying provinces as oppressed vassals sought independence from overextended empires. Even mighty Egypt, with its vast wealth and monumental temples, was stretched thin by wars with the Hittites and costly building projects. The Hittite Empire itself teetered on the edge, beset by both rebellious neighbors and internal division. It was into this fragile world that the mysterious sea peoples appeared. To the scribes of the ancient kingdoms, they came from nowhere. Sudden, terrifying waves of raiders who struck coastal cities and toppled armies. But before their sails were sighted, the stage had already been set. The Mediterranean was not a fortress, but a web of dependencies waiting for the wrong spark to unravel it. The sea peoples would be that spark, but to understand their impact, we must first appreciate what was lost. This was a world where kings saw themselves as God's chosen rulers, where trade was the lifeblood of civilization, and where a single disruption could bring an empire to its knees. In this sense, the arrival of the sea peoples was less the cause of collapse, and more the final hammer blow that shattered an already cracking system. The first whispers of the sea peoples come not from legend, but from the clay tablets and carved inscriptions of the great powers who suddenly found themselves under siege. Egyptian scribes, ever meticulous in recording their pharaohs' victories, speak of strange invaders arriving by both land and sea. They describe them not as a single people, but as a confederation, tribes and clans bound together by desperation or ambition, sweeping across the Mediterranean in search of new lands. The Hittites were among the first to feel the storm. Letters discovered in the ruins of their once mighty capital at Hattusa reveal pleas for grain shipments. The empire, already strained by famine, was ill-prepared for coastal raids. Ports that once supplied the Hittite kings fell to sudden attacks, disrupting food supplies and cutting lifelines to the heartland. For the Hittites, already struggling to hold their empire together, the Sea People's arrival was catastrophic. Within a generation, the empire that had rivaled Egypt vanished from the historical record. Meanwhile, in the Aegean, the cities of Mycenaean Greece, famed for their palaces, warriors, and epics that later inspired Homer, also faced disaster. Archaeology reveals layer upon layer of destruction in once thriving centres like Pylos and Mycenae. Fire consumed the palaces, walls crumbled, and writing in the Linear B script ceased altogether. While scholars debate whether the Sea Peoples were the direct cause, or whether they arrived as opportunists after internal collapse, the result was the same. A cultural breakdown so profound that Greece entered centuries of Dark Age silence. In Egypt, the threat was more direct and vividly recorded. Reliefs from the reign of Pharaoh Meneptah show scenes of battle against these invaders, depicting foreign warriors with feathered headdresses, round shields, and ox-drawn carts carrying their families. Unlike simple raiders, these were migrating peoples, moving with wives and children, suggesting not just conquest, but resettlement. Their sudden arrival turned the fertile Nile Delta into a battleground. To the kingdoms of the Bronze Age, the Sea Peoples seemed to emerge from the horizon without warning, like a storm breaking over calm seas. Yet their movements were part of a wider chain reaction. Famine, migration, rebellion, and collapse all feeding into one another. For the first time in centuries, the established order of the Mediterranean faced enemies it could neither predict nor easily contain. The Sea Peoples were not just raiders. They were a symptom of a world already unraveling, and their appearance signaled that the age of kings and palaces was nearing its end. The great mystery of the Sea Peoples is not only what they did, but who they were. Ancient sources name them with cryptic labels: Shurden, Shekelesh, Peliset, Danayan, Cheka, and others. Each name hints at a distinct group, perhaps with its own homeland, yet they appear in history as a shifting alliance bound by the shared act of migration and war. Scholars have tried to match these names to later peoples, suggesting the Shurden may have been ancestors of Sardinians, the Peliset linked to the Philistines of the Bible, the Danayan perhaps connected to the Homeric Danaans of Greece, but certainty eludes us. What unites the fragments of evidence is the image of a restless, seafaring population. Their weapons, long swords, spears, and large round shields, appear in archaeological finds across the Mediterranean. Their helmets, often depicted with plumes or horns, set them apart from the armies of Egypt or the Hittites. They were not simply mercenaries. Though some were hired as soldiers in foreign armies, many came as migrants with wives, children, and livestock in tow. This detail suggests desperation, a mass displacement rather than mere raiding. Why did they move? Here, history blurs into speculation. Some argue climate change and famine pushed them from homelands in the Aegean or Anatolia. Others point to the fall of Mycenaean palaces, which may have expelled warriors and their dependents into the wider Mediterranean. Still others suggest political upheaval forced entire communities onto the seas. Whatever the cause, their movement was no mere trickle. It was a tidal wave that reshaped the political map. Egyptian records describe them as a coalition, not unlike a pirate confederacy, though far more dangerous. Reliefs show their ships, sturdy, wide-hulled vessels with crews of warriors ready to leap ashore. Their mobility made them unpredictable. They could strike a coastal town, vanish into the horizon, and reappear hundreds of miles away. But unlike ordinary raiders, they aimed to conquer, settle, and claim territory. To the Bronze Age empires, the Sea Peoples embodied chaos. They had no single king, no permanent capital, and no fixed borders. This made them nearly impossible to defeat permanently. Even if one band was crushed in battle, others continued their march, driven by hunger, opportunity, or sheer momentum. In truth, the Sea Peoples remain an enigma. We know them only through the desperate accounts of the civilizations they attacked. And in those records, they are not individuals, but a storm, an unstoppable force that swept across the Mediterranean and left only ruins in its wake. By the dawn of the 12th century BCE, the movements of the Sea Peoples had escalated from raids to full-scale campaigns. The pattern was always the same: swift arrival, sudden devastation, and the collapse of cities that had stood for centuries. Archaeology across the Mediterranean bears silent witness to their passage: charred ruins, toppled walls, and abandoned palaces. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire, once one of the great powers of the Near East, fell shockingly fast. Cities along the coast, crucial for supplying the empire with grain and trade goods, were hit hardest. Ugarit, a bustling port city in modern-day Syria, provides a chilling snapshot of the chaos. Letters found in its ruins plead for urgent military aid. The enemy ships are already here. Our cities are burning. No rescue came. The city was destroyed, its palaces reduced to rubble, its population scattered or enslaved. For Ugarit, the Bronze Age ended in a single catastrophic blow. Farther west, the Aegean also burned. The Mycenaean citadels, once centers of wealth and power, fell in waves of destruction. Pylos, famed for its palace archives, was sacked and abandoned. Mycenae itself, the legendary seat of Agamemnon, was scarred by fire and never regained its former prominence. Whether the Sea Peoples caused these disasters directly or arrived as opportunists amid internal turmoil, their presence amplified the collapse. The great warrior kings of the Mycenaean world vanished into myth, leaving behind little more than epic poetry to preserve their memory. Even Egypt, the most enduring of the Bronze Age kingdoms, was shaken. Under Pharaoh Meneptah, inscriptions describe a great battle in which the Sea Peoples and their allies attempted to invade the Nile Delta. Reliefs depict chaos on the water: Egyptian ships clashing with foreign vessels, arrows raining down, and enemy warriors tumbling into the Nile. Though Egypt claimed victory, the struggle revealed the scale of the threat. These were not mere raiders, but organized forces capable of challenging one of history's greatest civilizations. Everywhere they went, the Sea Peoples left more than ruins. They left fear, instability, and an enduring sense that the old order could no longer protect its people. The world of palaces, scribes, and kings was crumbling under the weight of fire and sword. The campaigns of the Sea Peoples were not isolated acts of violence. They were shockwaves that rippled across the Mediterranean, accelerating the collapse of an interconnected world. And for the survivors, the question became not how to rebuild, but whether rebuilding was even possible. If the Sea Peoples toppled kingdoms across the Mediterranean, Egypt was their final and fiercest challenge. By the early 12th century BCE, waves of migrants and warriors pressed into the Nile Delta, threatening to overwhelm the land that had been a superpower for over 1,000 years. But unlike the Hittites or the Mycenaeans, Egypt would not fall so easily. The pharaoh who faced them was Ramesses III, a ruler of the New Kingdom's 20th dynasty. His inscriptions, carved into the walls of the mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, remain our most vivid account of the Sea People's assault. The reliefs show war on an epic scale: lines of Egyptian archers unleashing volleys, war chariots racing across the battlefield, and foreign ships crowded with warriors, their families and belongings piled aboard. The Sea Peoples came not as raiders, but as entire migrating communities: women, children, and ox-drawn carts following their warriors into battle. Ramesses describes them as a coalition: the Peliset, Cheka, Shekelesh, Denayan, and Weshesh. Each group had already ravaged other lands, but now they turned their eyes on the fertile Nile. For them, Egypt was not only wealthy, but offered something more precious: stability and farmland in a world where famine and war had made survival precarious. The pharaoh, however, was prepared. Egyptian spies had reported the movements of the invaders, and Ramesses set traps along both land and sea. In a decisive naval engagement, Egyptian ships, lighter and more maneuverable, surrounded the sea people's vessels, hemming them in with grappling hooks while archers rained down arrows from the decks. On land, Egyptian chariots crushed the advancing columns before they could penetrate the Nile Delta. The invaders' wagons, meant to resettle their people, became their undoing, clumsy and slow. They were easy prey for Egyptian counterattacks. The victory was total. Reliefs show foreign warriors cut down, their wives and children captured, their ships seized. Rameses declared triumphantly that Egypt had annihilated them, laid them low, and trampled them down. Yet the very need for such elaborate defense revealed the gravity of the threat. No earlier pharaoh had faced an enemy like this. A people with no single homeland, united only by desperation and the will to survive. Egypt had withstood the storm, but at great cost. The kingdom was never quite the same afterward. Resources were drained, foreign possessions in Canaan were gradually abandoned, and Egypt began its slow decline. Still, for a moment, Rameses III had turned back the tide and ensured that Egypt's legacy would endure long after the Sea Peoples vanished into history's shadows. Although Egypt triumphed under Rameses III, the Sea Peoples were not erased from history. Defeat in the Nile Delta did not destroy them, it scattered them. Instead of vanishing, many of these displaced peoples carved out new homes along the eastern Mediterranean coast, reshaping the cultural map of the region. The most famous of these were the Peliset, widely identified with the Philistines of biblical tradition. Driven back from Egypt, they settled in the coastal plain of Canaan, establishing cities that would become famous. Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron. Archaeology supports this story. Excavations in these cities reveal pottery styles distinct from their Canaanite neighbours, designs echoing Aegean traditions, painted with geometric patterns and motifs foreign to the Levant. Their architecture, weaponry, and even diet suggest a blend of local customs with intrusive elements from across the sea. The Philistines were not merely refugees, they were cultural innovators who forged a new identity in their adopted land. Other groups also left their mark. The Shurden, remembered in Egyptian records as both foes and mercenaries, may have settled in Sardinia, where distinctive stone towers called nuraghe appear around this time. The Cheka are thought to have taken control of the port city of Dor in northern Canaan, turning it into a maritime hub. The Shekelesh perhaps settled in Sicily, their name echoing the island's later identity. Though the evidence is fragmentary, a picture emerges of displaced peoples transforming into rooted communities, leaving legacies that survived long after the Bronze Age collapse. For Egypt, the aftermath meant withdrawal. Though victorious, the kingdom could no longer maintain its far-flung empire in Canaan. The rise of new powers, the Philistines in the coastal plains, the Arameans in the interior, made Egyptian control increasingly tenuous. What had once been Egyptian provinces became independent, or fell under the influence of new cultures born from chaos. The Bronze Age world had fractured. Where once stood vast empires and interconnected trade, now smaller kingdoms, city-states, and migrating peoples filled the vacuum. The Sea Peoples were both a cause and a symptom of this transformation. They had shattered old systems, but in their wake, new societies emerged, societies that would shape the course of the early Iron Age. The chaos of their invasions was real, but so was their resilience. In defeat, they became founders. Their names survive not only in inscriptions of fear, but in the living cultures that rose from the ruins of the Bronze Age. By the early 12th century BCE, the world of the great Bronze Age kingdoms was gone. Palaces lay in ruins, trade networks shattered, and literacy itself nearly disappeared in vast stretches of the Mediterranean. The arrival of the Sea Peoples was dramatic, but the collapse cannot be explained by them alone. They were one piece of a far larger puzzle, an upheaval so profound that historians still debate its causes 3,000 years later. Climate played its role. Evidence from pollen samples, tree rings, and dried lake beds shows a prolonged period of drought around 1200 BCE. Without rain, harvests failed, and without harvests, famine spread. Hungry populations rioted or migrated, searching for food and security. In this context, the mass movements of the Sea Peoples may have been a symptom of the same crisis that toppled empires, survival in a world that could no longer sustain them. At the same time, earthquakes shook the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological layers in cities such as Troy, Mycenae, and Ugarit show signs of destruction consistent with seismic activity. Rebuilding after such disasters would have required strong central governments, but those very governments were weakened by famine, rebellion, and war. The blows landed all at once, and recovery was impossible. Economic collapse followed. The Bronze Age was built on trade in essential resources: copper and tin for weaponry, grain for armies, luxury goods for kings. When long-distance routes were cut, whether by war, piracy, or the destruction of ports, the system unraveled. Without tin, bronze production ceased. Without bronze, armies lost their technological edge. The empires that had depended on these networks could not adapt quickly enough. Internally, revolts erupted. Subject peoples who had once endured heavy tribute saw their chance to break free. In some places, commoners may have risen against palace elites, contributing to the destruction of great centres. The fall of Mycenaean Greece, for instance, may have owed as much to internal strife as to foreign attack. The result was a domino effect. One kingdom after another toppled: the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Canaanite city-states, and eventually even Egypt's empire abroad. What remained were smaller, fragmented societies struggling to survive in a changed world. The Sea Peoples were remembered because they gave a face to the chaos, foreign invaders sweeping in from the sea. Yet the collapse was bigger than them. It was a perfect storm: climate, rebellion, earthquakes, famine, and war all converging. The Bronze Age had ended, and a new era, the Iron Age, was beginning. Though the Sea Peoples vanished as suddenly as they appeared, their memory lingered in the stories, texts, and cultures that followed. To the Egyptians, they remained a cautionary tale etched in stone, a reminder of how close the kingdom had come to being swept away. The reliefs at Medinet Habu stand as one of the most vivid monuments of the late Bronze Age, showing foreign warriors with feathered headdresses and ox-drawn wagons, forever frozen in battle against Ramesses III. For Egypt, this victory became part of national pride, a final moment of glory before its own slow decline. Elsewhere, their legacy is more indirect. The Philistines, likely descended from the Peliset branch of the Sea Peoples, became one of the most formidable groups in the biblical narrative. From their new cities in Canaan, they clashed repeatedly with the Israelites, giving rise to tales that still resonate today. The legendary duel of David and Goliath is often framed as an Israelite triumph over Philistine might, echoes of the larger cultural memory of outsiders who arrived by the sea. Greek traditions may also preserve distant echoes. The Homeric poems speak of upheaval, migrations, and returning warriors from Troy who found their homelands destroyed. While not a direct reference, the cultural trauma of the Bronze Age collapse may have fed into these myths, embedding the Sea People's shadow into the foundations of Greek storytelling. Similarly, fragments of legend across the Mediterranean, tales of wandering peoples, foreign settlers, and sudden destruction, may trace back to the migrations that once terrified Egypt and toppled empires. Archaeology fills in what myth cannot. Distinctive pottery styles, weapon forms, and settlement patterns reveal how the Sea Peoples integrated into their new environments. In places like Philistine Canaan, their influence blended with local traditions to create hybrid cultures. Over generations, they ceased to be Sea Peoples at all and became something new: locals, rooted in the lands they had once invaded. Their greatest legacy, however, lies in the memory of collapse itself. The Bronze Age world was a network of kings, palaces, and scribes who believed their order permanent. The Sea Peoples shattered that illusion. They became the human face of systemic collapse, a reminder that even the mightiest empires can fall when the pressures of environment, economy, and migration converge. In that sense, their story has never truly ended. It survives as a warning. Civilizations are fragile, and the forces that undo them are often not strangers from afar, but the combined weight of crises already at the door. For all the devastation they caused, the Sea Peoples remain an enigma. We know them not through their own words, but through the desperate accounts of those who fought them. Egyptian reliefs, broken cuneiform letters, and layers of destruction in ruined cities are the fragments from which historians have tried to reconstruct their identity. Yet questions linger. Were they exiles from collapsing palaces in the Aegean? Climate refugees fleeing famine in Anatolia? Pirates, mercenaries, or migrants seeking new lands? The truth may be that they were all of these at once, a shifting confederation of peoples bound by shared necessity. This uncertainty has only fueled fascination. Unlike the Egyptians or Hittites, the Sea Peoples left no empire, no archives, no monuments. They were remembered not as rulers, but as destroyers, the faceless storm that swept away the world of the Bronze Age. In this sense, they belong to that rare category of historical actors who shaped an era without leaving their own voice behind. They remind us that history is often written by the survivors, and that entire peoples can fade into silence once their role has been played. Yet their influence endures. The collapse they accelerated gave birth to the Iron Age, when new powers emerged from the rubble. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the Phoenician traders, the Arameans, and eventually the Greeks, all rose in the vacuum the Sea Peoples helped create. Even Egypt, though weakened, adapted to survive in a new world. In this way, the chaos they embodied also cleared the ground for renewal. Their story has modern resonance too. The Sea Peoples were migrants in an age of crisis, pushed by famine and instability to seek survival elsewhere. Their arrival destabilized fragile states, toppled empires, and transformed entire regions. It is a reminder that human movement, especially on a large scale, can be as powerful a force in history as armies or kings. Behind the carved reliefs of battle, we glimpse families in ox-drawn carts, carrying all they had into the unknown. In the end, the Sea Peoples stand as both destroyers and creators. They ended one age and helped forge another, leaving behind more questions than answers. Their sails vanished over the horizon more than 3,000 years ago, but their shadow still falls across history. A reminder that civilizations, no matter how mighty, are never eternal. Long before the name of Alexander echoed across continents, Macedon was seen as a rough, half-barbaric kingdom sitting on the edge of the Greek world. To the refined city-states of Athens or Thebes, Macedonians were mountain folk, riders, herdsmen, and hunters, more at home in rugged highlands than in marble courtyards. Yet this very landscape forged their character. Life in Macedon was harsh, resources limited, and survival demanded toughness. Every boy grew up handling weapons, every man was expected to ride, and loyalty to kin and king was absolute. Macedonian kings understood this warrior ethos and wove it into their rule. Unlike in Athens, where politics was debated in the assembly, or in Sparta, where discipline was dictated by the state, Macedon's power rested on personal bonds. The king was not only a ruler, but also a war leader who dined, hunted, and bled alongside his companions, the elite noble cavalrymen known as the hetairoi. These relationships created a military culture built on honor and trust. Fighting was not just duty, it was a way to prove loyalty to the monarch and win glory for the clan. Still, Macedon was not isolated. Greek influence seeped in, particularly in the reigns of kings like Archelaus and Philip II. From their southern neighbours, the Macedonians borrowed tactical thinking, the idea of drilled formations, and a taste for organised strategy. Yet they did not abandon their tribal warrior traditions. Instead, they blended them. The result was a culture that valued both ferocious courage and disciplined cohesion, a balance that most other armies struggled to achieve. What truly distinguished Macedon from the rest of Greece was its fusion of cavalry and infantry. In many Greek states, cavalry was an afterthought, but Macedon's open plains made horsemen vital. Noble families raised their sons in the saddle, and entire clans supplied mounted warriors. Meanwhile, common soldiers drilled as infantry, wielding longer spears than their southern cousins. The bond between horsemen and foot soldiers was not one of superiority, but of partnership, forged in countless campaigns along Macedonia's borders. By the time Philip II rose to power in the mid-4th century BCE, the foundations were already laid. Macedon was a society where warfare was not occasional but constant, where men lived with weapons close at hand, and where military service defined identity. What outsiders dismissed as barbarism was in truth a crucible, one that would produce an army unlike any the ancient world had ever seen. The Macedonian phalanx was the cornerstone of Macedon's military revolution, but it was not simply a copy of the hoplite formations used by southern Greeks. Philip II, father of Alexander the Great, took a familiar concept and pushed it to its absolute limit, creating a war machine that was both terrifying and nearly unstoppable. The traditional Greek hoplite fought in close ranks, armed with a round shield and a spear barely 2 meters long. In contrast, Philip armed his infantry, the pegotyroi, or foot companions, with the sarissa, a pike that could reach 5 to 6 meters in length. The sheer size of this weapon gave Macedonian soldiers a reach advantage that no enemy spear could match. When a phalanx lowered its sarissas in unison, it created a bristling forest of spear points, 5 or 6 rows deep, capable of skewering any force that tried to charge it head-on. Of course, such a weapon was heavy and unwieldy. To handle it, Macedonian soldiers carried smaller shields strapped to their shoulders, freeing both hands to grip the massive spear. Their armor was lighter than that of the traditional hoplite, sacrificing some protection for agility and endurance. Training was relentless, drilling in tight formations, learning to advance and retreat as a single body, and practicing how to keep their sarissas leveled even under pressure. The phalanx was not just a collection of men, it was a living wall of iron, each soldier locked into position by the discipline of the unit. The strength of the Macedonian phalanx lay in unity. A single man could not wield the sarissa effectively, but hundreds moving together created an impenetrable barrier. Enemies who tried to break the lines were impaled before they could get close. Cavalry found it nearly impossible to charge into such bristling pikes. Even veteran hoplites, who had prided themselves on their own phalanx tactics for centuries, found themselves outmatched by this innovation. But Philip's genius was not only in designing the sarissa phalanx, it was in making it the centerpiece of a combined arms strategy. The phalanx fixed enemy forces in place, holding them with its unbreakable wall of spears. Then, at the decisive moment, Macedonian cavalry or lighter troops could strike the flanks and finish the battle. The phalanx was both shield and hammer, a tool of dominance that turned Macedonia from a backwater into the master of Greece. This was more than just a formation. It was the beating heart of Macedonian military culture. And in the hands of Philip's son, Alexander, it would carry Macedon across the known world. Among all the weapons of antiquity, few carried the same aura of dominance as the Macedonian sarissa. This extraordinary pike was more than just a tool of war. It was a statement of innovation, discipline, and identity. To wield it was to declare oneself part of the Macedonian military machine, a cog in a system that relied on unity and precision above all else. The sarissa's design was deceptively simple. Made from tough cornel wood, it stretched 5 to 6 meters in length, dwarfing the spears of traditional hoplites. Its sheer size required both hands to control, and its weight was counterbalanced by a heavy butt spike, which could also serve as a secondary weapon if the main tip broke in combat. Soldiers trained to handle the sarissa from a young age, drilling tirelessly to keep its long shaft level and aligned with their comrades. The weapon's strength came not from the individual, but from the phalanx itself, where dozens of spearheads projected outward in an impenetrable line. On the battlefield, the sarissa transformed how enemies perceived Macedonian armies. An approaching phalanx looked like a moving forest of steel. Horses balked at charging into it, and infantry who dared to advance were skewered before they could even swing their swords. To face such a wall was to confront death in its most orderly form, relentless, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient. Yet the sarissa was not invincible. Its unwieldy length made it difficult in broken terrain or at close quarters. But this was precisely where Macedonian military culture shone. Soldiers were trained to adapt, to hold formation on open ground, and to rely on cavalry or lighter troops when maneuver was required. Philip II understood that the sarissa worked best as part of a larger system, and he ensured that his army combined the phalanx with flexible units that could exploit weaknesses. Beyond its practical use, the sarissa became a cultural emblem. It symbolized the difference between Macedon and its Greek rivals. Where other armies valued individual valor, the Macedonians exalted collective strength. The Sarissa reminded every soldier that his survival depended on the man beside him, and that only through discipline could the formation hold. In this way, the Sarissa was more than wood and iron. It was the physical embodiment of Macedonian unity, the weapon that turned a peripheral kingdom into a superpower. Wherever its shadow fell, from Cheronea to the banks of the Indus, it carried with it the unmistakable mark of Macedonian dominance. The Sarissa may have been the symbol of Macedonian power, but without relentless training, it was nothing more than an oversized spear. The true strength of the Macedonian army came from its discipline, a quality drilled into every soldier by a system of training that was both demanding and revolutionary. Under Philip II, training ceased to be a seasonal duty and became a year-round obligation. In many Greek states, men served as hoplites for a short campaign and then returned home to their farms. Macedon was different. Its soldiers were professionals, kept in constant preparation, their lives woven into the rhythm of drill and battle readiness. This shift created not just an army, but a permanent warrior class loyal to the king. Daily exercises honed their ability to wield the enormous sarissa in tight formation. Soldiers marched in step, practiced lowering and raising their pikes on command, and drilled in maneuvers that demanded absolute synchronization. If even a few men broke ranks, the phalanx could collapse. Thus, every soldier understood that discipline was survival. Officers enforced this ruthlessly, punishing slackers, rewarding excellence, and ensuring that no one forgot the stakes of failure. Training extended beyond the phalanx itself. Macedonian armies included light infantry, archers, and cavalry, all of whom had to work in concert. Soldiers rehearsed complex maneuvers in which phalanx formations pinned down the enemy, while cavalry prepared a devastating flank charge. Coordination was everything. An undisciplined force could never achieve such harmony, but the Macedonians drilled until these maneuvers became second nature. Physical endurance was another cornerstone. Soldiers marched long distances with full kit, accustomed to carrying their sarissas, shields, and provisions over rough terrain. Campaigns often took them far from home, and the army had to move swiftly despite its heavy equipment. The training ensured that fatigue would not break their cohesion when battle came. This discipline fostered an army that was not only effective but also loyal. Soldiers knew that their skill set was unique, their bond with comrades unbreakable, and their position in society elevated. Fighting for the king was not just duty, it was identity. In return, the king rewarded them with spoils of war, land grants, and honor, reinforcing their loyalty. The Macedonian military culture was thus built on a paradox: fierce individual warriors molded into a collective machine. It was this discipline, born of constant drill and hardened by trust, that made the phalanx and its sarissas an unstoppable force. If the Macedonian phalanx was the anvil, then the cavalry was the hammer. No part of Macedonian military culture better embodied loyalty and elite status than the hetairoi, the king's companions. These horsemen were not common soldiers, but nobles, bound to the king by ties of blood, friendship, and shared glory. Their role in battle was decisive, and their bond with the ruler gave the Macedonian army a personal character, unlike any other in the ancient world. The companions rode powerful horses bred on the Macedonian plains, trained for speed and shock. Unlike Greek cavalry, which often harassed enemies with javelins, the hetairoi specialized in direct charges. Armed with long lances and clad in armor, they struck with the full weight of horse and rider, smashing into enemy lines where the phalanx had fixed them in place. Few armies could withstand such a coordinated assault, first pinned by a forest of sarissas, then broken by a thunderous charge of cavalry. Training was as strict for the horsemen as for the infantry. Riders drilled constantly in maintaining formation at speed, wheeling and pivoting as a unit. The king himself often rode among them, leading charges personally. This was more than symbolism. In a society where loyalty to the monarch was paramount, the sight of the king at the front inspired devotion and courage. Companions were expected to follow him not only into battle, but into death if necessary. The relationship between the king and his companions was as much social as military. They dined together at royal banquets, hunted side by side, and shared the spoils of conquest. This intimacy fostered a culture where battlefield loyalty was inseparable from personal friendship. It also allowed the king to keep the nobility close, ensuring their power was tied to his success. Beyond the elite cavalry, Macedon also fielded lighter horsemen, scouts, raiders, and flankers who complemented the companions' shock tactics. Together, these forces gave the Macedonian army unmatched flexibility. Where the phalanx was unyielding, the cavalry was swift. Where the infantry held the line, the riders delivered the killing blow. This dual strength, an impenetrable infantry wall combined with devastating cavalry charges, was the hallmark of Macedonian warfare. It was a balance few other armies achieved, and it reflected the culture of Macedon itself. A kingdom where every class, from farmer soldier to noble rider, was bound together by war and by loyalty to the king. The genius of Macedonian military culture was not just in the sarissa, or the companions, but in the way Philip II, and later Alexander the Great, wove all elements of the army into a seamless whole. Where other states relied on one dominant arm, Macedon perfected the art of combined arms warfare, ensuring that infantry, cavalry, and specialists worked together in coordinated harmony. At the center stood the phalanx. Its unbreakable wall of sarissas fixed the enemy in place, forcing them to commit their strength frontally. Alone, the phalanx could hold but not always destroy. Its very rigidity made it vulnerable on the flanks. But this vulnerability was by design, for it baited opponents into focusing on the dense ranks of infantry, while Macedon's other units prepared the decisive strike. That strike came from the cavalry, particularly the companions. Once the enemy was locked in combat with the phalanx, the king and his horsemen swept around the sides, delivering a crushing charge into exposed flanks or rear. Battles such as Cheronea in 338 BCE showcased this strategy brilliantly. While the phalanx absorbed the Greek coalition head-on, Philip and Alexander led devastating cavalry maneuvers that shattered enemy lines. Supporting these two main arms were a variety of specialized troops. Hypaspists, elite infantry who guarded the vulnerable junction between phalanx and cavalry, could move more flexibly than the heavy pikemen. Light infantry, peltasts, archers, and slingers harassed foes, disrupted enemy skirmishes, and provided cover for the slower phalanx. Engineers and siege specialists also became a standard part of Macedonian campaigns, allowing the army to storm fortified cities that had once seemed impregnable. The brilliance of this system was its adaptability. Macedonian commanders did not see their army as a single blunt instrument, but as a toolkit, with each component supporting the others. In open battle, the phalanx held while cavalry delivered the killing blow. Against irregular foes, light troops took prominence. In sieges, engineers and disciplined infantry led the assault. The key was coordination, drilled into the soldiers through endless training and enforced by a clear chain of command centered on the king. This integration of arms was more than battlefield technique. It was a cultural expression of Macedon's unity. Every class, from common farmer infantrymen to noble cavalrymen, had its role. Success depended not on isolated heroics, but on collective precision. In this way, Macedonian strategy mirrored Macedonian society, a hierarchy bound together by loyalty, discipline, and the promise of conquest. The Macedonian army was not merely a collection of formations and weapons. It was a brotherhood bound by loyalty to the king and by a shared warrior ethos that infused every aspect of their lives. Unlike many Greek city-states, where military service was a civic duty limited to citizens, Macedonian identity itself revolved around being a soldier. To be Macedonian was to fight, to hunt, and to follow the king into war. At the center of this ethos was personal loyalty to the monarch. The king was not distant or ceremonial. He was a commander who rode at the front of cavalry charges and camped alongside his men. Kings like Philip II and Alexander the Great earned devotion not only through their authority, but through visible courage. They endured the same hardships as their soldiers, bled with them in battle, and shared in their victories. This created a bond that no decree or law could enforce, loyalty forged in fire and steel. The Macedonians also valued camaraderie within their ranks. Soldiers trained together daily, ate at common messes and marched long distances side by side. The phalanx demanded absolute trust. Each man's survival depended on his neighbor holding firm. To abandon formation was to doom not only oneself, but the entire line. This reliance on one another fostered a culture where betrayal was unthinkable and bravery was expected. Rituals reinforced this ethos. Banquets after campaigns, royal hunts, and religious sacrifices all reminded soldiers that war was not only duty, but an honored tradition. The sharing of spoils was equally important. Victories brought wealth, land, and prestige, binding soldiers' fortunes to those of the king. Many men rose in status through loyal service, their families rewarded with positions and privileges. Discipline, too, was inseparable from loyalty. Cowardice or desertion was punished harshly, while valor was celebrated publicly. A Macedonian soldier fought not just for survival, but for reputation, the eternal honor of being counted among the king's companions in arms. This pursuit of glory blended tribal warrior traditions with Greek ideals of honor, creating a distinctive martial culture that prized both collective strength and personal valor. Ultimately, this ethos made the Macedonian army more than a military force. It was a society in arms, bound by loyalty to king and comrades, sustained by shared hardship, and driven by a belief that conquest was their destiny. Without this warrior culture, the sarissa and the phalanx would have been hollow. With it, they became unstoppable. The true test of Macedonian military culture came not in drills or border skirmishes, but in the crucible of conquest. Under Philip II and his son Alexander, Macedon transformed from a peripheral kingdom into the master of Greece, and soon after, the architect of one of history's largest empires. The army that Philip had forged and Alexander inherited proved itself time and again, not just through brute strength, but through strategy, discipline, and the warrior ethos that defined Macedonian identity. Philip began by unifying Macedonia itself, subduing fractious nobles and securing the kingdom's borders. Once his foundation was solid, he turned outward. In 338 BCE, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip and the young Alexander faced a coalition of Greek city-states, including Athens and Thebes. Here, the Macedonian system revealed its brilliance. The phalanx pinned the enemy while Philip staged a feigned retreat, drawing the Athenians out of position. At the critical moment, Alexander led the companion cavalry in a thunderous charge, shattering the Theban sacred band and securing victory. Greece was subdued, not just by force, but by the demonstration of a new kind of warfare. When Alexander succeeded his father in 336 BCE, he inherited this military machine and carried it farther than anyone could have imagined. Against the mighty Persian Empire, the Macedonians proved that their culture of discipline and combined arms could topple even the wealthiest and most established power of the age. At Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, the formula repeated itself. The phalanx held firm, absorbing the brunt of Persian numbers, while the companions delivered decisive strikes at the flanks and center. The soldiers' loyalty was tested in these campaigns, as Alexander led them across Asia Minor, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and even to the Indus Valley. Their willingness to endure hunger, heat, and exhaustion reflected not only their faith in their king, but also their deeply ingrained culture of discipline and honor. The bond between ruler and soldier, born of shared hardship, kept the army together, even when the horizon seemed endless. Macedonian conquests were not simply a sequence of victories. They were the flowering of a military culture designed for expansion. Every spear thrust of the phalanx, every charge of the companions, and every coordinated maneuver was the culmination of centuries of tribal ferocity, Greek tactical influence, and relentless drilling. Expansion was not an accident. It was the natural expression of Macedonian military identity. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his empire stretched from Greece to India, but the Macedonian military culture he and his father had built outlasted even that vast domain. The innovations of Philip and Alexander left a mark so deep that centuries of generals, from the Hellenistic successors to the Romans, would wrestle with their example. The Macedonian way of war was not simply about weapons. It was about a culture that fused discipline, loyalty, and innovation into a model for conquest. The immediate heirs to this legacy were the Diadochi, Alexander's generals who carved up his empire into rival kingdoms. Each inherited armies drilled in the Macedonian style, and the wars of succession saw phalanxes clashing against phalanxes, companion cavalry charging into former comrades, and siegecraft on a scale never before seen. Though fragmented, these armies carried forward the traditions of sarissa, phalanx, and combined arms, proving that the Macedonian system was not tied to a single king, but had become a transferable institution of power. Even beyond the Hellenistic world, the shadow of Macedon loomed large. The Romans, who eventually absorbed the Greek kingdoms, studied the Macedonian phalanx carefully. They admired its discipline and its terrifying strength in open battle, but also recognized its limitations, especially in rough terrain or against flexible enemies. The Roman legion was, in part, an answer to the phalanx, adopting its professionalism and discipline, but favoring versatility over rigidity. In this way, Macedonian warfare indirectly shaped Rome's rise to dominance. Culturally, the Macedonian military became a model of the warrior state. Its ethos of loyalty to a charismatic leader, its emphasis on collective discipline, and its blending of tribal courage with tactical sophistication created a blueprint that echoed through later ages. For centuries, the image of the phalanx advancing with a forest of sarissas remained one of the most iconic symbols of military might. Yet perhaps the greatest legacy of Macedonian military culture was psychological. It proved that a so-called backward kingdom could, through reform, training, and innovation, outfight the most established powers of its age. It showed that discipline could magnify numbers, and that unity could overcome wealth and tradition. The Macedonian army was more than a force. It was a lesson in what a society can achieve when its culture of war becomes its defining identity. In this way, even as kingdoms fell and empires shifted, the spirit of the Macedonian phalanx lived on, etched into the strategies of generals and the memory of history itself. Sappho was born around 630 BCE on the island of Lesbos, a jewel of the northeastern Aegean. Though small, Lesbos was renowned for its fertile lands, lively trade, and flourishing cultural scene. It was a place where music and poetry were woven into daily life, and this artistic environment shaped Sappho from the very beginning. Unlike many women of her time, who lived largely confined to domestic spheres, Sappho grew up in a society where aristocratic families valued education and refinement. Her privileged background gave her access to learning, performance, and the literary traditions of Greece. The world into which she was born was turbulent. The archaic age of Greece was an era of city-states experimenting with governance, warlords consolidating power, and poets finding their voices in a society that increasingly valued song and public performance. While male poets like Homer and Hesiod had already laid down epic foundations, Sappho's voice emerged from a different register. Not the battlefield or the council chamber, but the intimate chambers of human emotion. From an early age, she was immersed in music and verse. Poetry at this time was not simply written, it was sung, performed with the lyre before audiences both small and large. Sappho mastered this oral tradition, blending melody with meter to create verses that lingered long after the performance ended. Her poems were crafted in what later came to be called the Sapphic stanza, a rhythm and structure so distinctive it was named after her. Her family background remains partly mysterious, but ancient sources suggest she came from an aristocratic lineage. This status allowed her not only education but also social influence. She moved among the cultural elite of Lesbos, where poetry was more than entertainment. It was a marker of prestige and identity. Through her art, she could both express personal feelings and shape the cultural memory of her community. What makes Sappho's early presence remarkable is how it defied convention. While men dominated the poetic canon, her voice carved out a space for female experience. She wrote not of kings or gods in lofty grandeur, but of love, jealousy, longing, and the piercing vulnerability of desire. Even in a world that often dismissed women's words, Sappho's verses resonated so powerfully that they earned her lasting fame. Thus, from her beginnings on Lesbos, Sappho was already set apart. A woman whose poetry offered not only beauty but a new way of seeing the human heart. Sappho's fame was not built on solitary genius alone. It thrived within the intimate community she cultivated on Lesbos. Ancient accounts describe her as the center of a circle of young women, companions and pupils, who gathered to learn poetry, music, and refined culture under her guidance. In an age when women's voices were often muted, this circle was extraordinary, a space where female experience, emotion, and artistry could be expressed freely. The gatherings were both educational and artistic. Sappho taught her companions how to sing, dance, and compose verse to the lyre. These activities were not mere leisure. They were essential elements of aristocratic upbringing, training women to participate in ceremonies, festivals, and the social rituals of their communities. Yet under Sappho's guidance, these lessons transcended convention. Her poetry gave voice to the bonds between women, elevating friendship and desire into subjects worthy of art, no less significant than the heroics sung by Homeric bards. It is here that her reputation for writing about love between women emerges. Ancient sources often highlight her affectionate verses directed toward members of her circle. Whether these poems reflected actual relationships or simply the stylized language of intimacy common in Greek lyric poetry is still debated. What is certain, however, is that Sappho dared to write openly of female desire in a way no male poet of her time attempted. Her circle thus became not only a school of art, but a laboratory for a new kind of literary expression, personal, emotional, and deeply human. The role of women in Greek society varied by region, but in most places, their participation in public life was restricted. Lesbos, however, seems to have offered a slightly wider sphere, especially for women of aristocratic families. Sappho seized this space to its fullest, creating an enduring cultural legacy through her circle. It was through performance at banquets, weddings, and religious festivals that her verses reached broader audiences, spreading her name beyond the island's shores. The intimacy of this circle is perhaps why her poetry feels timeless. Unlike the epic battles of Homer, her verses focus on fleeting moments, a glance, a touch, the trembling of the heart. These fragments remind us that her art was born not in isolation, but in shared experiences among women bound together by song, memory, and emotion. In this circle, Sappho found both her inspiration and her audience, a community that allowed her to explore love and longing with a depth that still resonates across millennia. What sets Sappho apart in the grand tapestry of Greek literature is the subject matter of her poetry. While Homer sang of war and Hesiod of gods and labour, Sappho turned her gaze inward, to the realms of love, longing, and desire. She captured not the clash of armies, but the tremor of the heart, when one person looks upon another with admiration, envy, or yearning. Her work offered a radical shift in perspective, that the personal could be poetic, that the stirrings of affection could stand as subjects as powerful as any tale of heroes. Her surviving fragments reveal a remarkable sensitivity to human emotion. In one famous passage, Sappho describes the torment of watching a beloved speak to another. Her voice falters, her tongue breaks, her skin flushes, her ears ring, and her vision blurs. This is not divine myth, but the raw physicality of desire, universal, relatable, and painfully human. Even stripped of context, her words pulse with immediacy, allowing readers across millennia to feel what she felt. Her poems often invoked Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, as both patron and confidant. The divine presence in her verses was not remote or abstract. Aphrodite appeared as a figure who listened to prayers, comforted aching hearts, and even playfully intervened in mortal affairs of passion. By linking her own experiences to the goddess, Sappho elevated her feelings into the realm of the sacred. Love, she implied, was not trivial but divine, a force capable of reshaping lives as powerfully as war or politics. Equally striking is her attention to detail. She wrote of flowers, garlands, perfumes, and the sound of song, painting scenes of sensory richness that anchored emotion in the material world. This use of imagery made her work resonate in ways few poets could match. A mere glance at a lover's dress or the scent of garlands could become the spark for a poem that endured for centuries. Sappho's willingness to write about female desire also set her apart. While men celebrated love affairs with women or boys, Sappho gave voice to women's emotions. sometimes directed toward other women in her circle. Whether these verses reflected real relationships or stylized art, they carried a boldness unmatched in her time. In choosing love as her subject, Sappho redefined what poetry could be. She revealed that the deepest truths were not always found on the battlefield, but in the quiet, trembling moments of the heart. Even the most celebrated figures of antiquity were not immune to political upheaval, and Sappho was no exception. Ancient sources tell us that at some point in her life, she was forced into exile in Sicily, perhaps in the city of Syracuse. The exact reasons remain uncertain, as with so much of her biography, but historians suggest that political turmoil on Lesbos, possibly factional disputes among aristocratic families, drove her from her homeland. Exile was not uncommon in the turbulent world of archaic Greece, but for a poet whose verses were so deeply rooted in community and intimacy, such displacement must have been a profound wound. Her exile highlights a paradox of her life. On one hand, she was a woman whose art was cherished, performed, and celebrated. On the other, she was vulnerable to the same instability that swept away nobles and commoners alike. To leave Lesbos was to be severed from her circle of companions, the very heart of her inspiration. In her surviving fragments, we catch echoes of this loss, lines that speak of longing for home, of separation from beloved companions, and of the sorrow that distance brings. Though the fragments are incomplete, they carry the unmistakable tone of a poet wrestling with absence and yearning. This period also reinforced Sappho's resilience. If exile stripped her of security, it did not silence her voice. In Sicily, her reputation was such that her presence was remembered for generations. Later writers even claimed that the people of Syracuse honored her with a statue, testimony to the reach of her fame beyond her native island. It is striking that a woman poet, far from home and caught in political strife, could still command such admiration in a foreign city. Exile may also have deepened the universal quality of her poetry. Removed from the intimate setting of her circle, her verses gained a broader resonance. Themes of separation, longing, and the fragility of human ties were not just personal. They reflected the instability of her times, when wars, migrations, and political rivalries constantly tore communities apart. Though she eventually returned to Lesbos, exile left its mark. It shaped her voice, adding layers of sorrow and endurance to her celebration of love and beauty. Her struggles remind us that even in antiquity, the poet's life was not only about song, it was also about survival in a world where fortune could change with the wind. Sappho's poetry may survive today only in fragments, but in antiquity, her reputation was nothing short of legendary. She was celebrated not merely as a talented woman, but as one of the greatest lyric poets of Greece, an equal to Homer in renown, though her subject matter was worlds apart from his. Her verses were collected into at least 9 books, meticulously preserved and studied by scholars in Alexandria centuries after her death. To be given such treatment in a literary world dominated by men is a measure of the extraordinary impact her work had on Greek culture. The ancients often called her the 10th Muse, elevating her above mortal poets into the company of the divine inspirers of song and art. This title reflected more than admiration. It was an acknowledgement that her poetry carried a quality that felt transcendent. While others wrote of battles and kings, Sappho gave voice to human longing and intimate beauty with a clarity so profound that her work was considered divine revelation in itself. Her fame spread widely across the Greek world. Plato himself praised her, ranking her among the immortals of poetry. Comic playwrights referenced her. Philosophers quoted her lines. Even later Roman poets, from Catullus to Horace, found inspiration in her rhythms and imagery. The Sapphic stanza became a staple of classical verse, its distinctive pattern echoing through centuries of literature. Her popularity was not only due to her artistry, but also to the way she captured experiences that transcended time and gender. Her focus on desire, friendship, and the fragile beauty of life resonated across audiences. Men and women alike could see themselves in her words, finding reflections of their own loves and losses. At the same time, Sappho's fame was entangled with gossip and myth. Later writers, uncomfortable with the frankness of her verses about female desire, invented stories about her supposed passions for men, most famously a tale that she leapt to her death for love of a ferryman named Phaon. These legends tell us more about later anxieties than about Sappho herself, but they also show how her fame lingered, reshaped by each generation's imagination. In her own time, however, Sappho's name stood for mastery of lyric art. To sing like Sappho was to aspire to the highest form of poetic beauty. Her fame secured her a place in the canon of the greatest poets of Greece, where her name still stands, centuries after the voices of her contemporaries have faded into silence. Despite her towering fame in antiquity, the works of Sappho have reached us only in broken echoes. Once, her poetry filled 9 books in the great library of Alexandria, carefully catalogued by scholars who recognized her genius. But the fragile papyrus scrolls on which her verses were written could not withstand the centuries. Fires, neglect, and the simple decay of time erased most of her voice from the historical record. What survives today are only fragments, scraps preserved by quotation, commentary, or chance discovery. Many of these fragments are tiny, no more than a line or two quoted by later authors to illustrate grammar, meter, or vocabulary. Scholars of rhetoric and philosophy, fascinated by her precision of language, preserved snippets in their works without always realizing they were saving the only surviving pieces of her art. Other fragments come from papyri unearthed in Egypt, where the dry sands preserved discarded writings for millennia. Some of these discoveries, made as late as the 19th and 20th centuries, revealed entire stanzas thought lost forever. The most famous survival is the so-called Ode to Aphrodite, the only one of her poems to survive nearly complete. In it, she calls upon the goddess of love to ease her heartache, blending intimacy with divine imagery in a way that exemplifies her art. Even in translation, its rhythms and emotional force remain striking. Other longer fragments, though incomplete, still reveal her ability to capture both the grandeur of ritual and the delicate tremor of desire. The fragmentary nature of her legacy gives her poetry a haunting quality. Reading Sappho is often like overhearing half a conversation or catching a fleeting glimpse of something beautiful before it vanishes. Scholars have compared her fragments to ruins, broken but still majestic enough to reveal the greatness of what once stood in full, and yet these scattered remnants have been enough to secure her place in world literature. Few poets are remembered for so little surviving work, and yet Sappho remains immortal. The fact that a handful of verses, written 26 centuries ago, can still stir readers today speaks to the power of her voice. If so little endures, and yet moves us, one can only imagine the brilliance of the complete corpus that once existed. Her fragmentary survival has transformed her from a poet of the archaic age into a timeless figure, half present, half absent, her words reaching us across silence, like faint music carried by the wind. Though most of Sappho's poetry has been lost, the fragments that survived and the memory of her fame shaped generations of poets who came after her. In antiquity, she was regarded not as a curiosity, a woman poet in a man's world, but as a master whose artistry transcended gender. Her verses of longing and beauty set standards for lyric poetry that echoed across Greece, Rome, and far beyond. Greek contemporaries and successors revered her openly. The lyric poet Alcaeus, also from Lesbos, exchanged verses with her, suggesting a mutual respect among poets of the island. Plato, centuries later, praised her as the 10th muse, placing her in divine company and suggesting that her poetry was a gift of inspiration equal to any hymn to the gods. In his dialogues, he quotes her lines as though they were part of the common heritage of Greek thought. The Romans, too, carried her legacy forward. Poets like Catullus and Horace studied her rhythms and imagery, adapting the Sapphic stanza into Latin verse. Catullus, in particular, imitated her intimacy and passion, weaving her style into his own love poetry. Through them, Sappho's influence seeped into the heart of Roman literature, ensuring that her voice shaped the literary traditions of the Western world long after her original works had begun to fade. Her reach did not end with antiquity. In the Renaissance, when scholars rediscovered ancient texts, Sappho's name re-emerged as a symbol of lyric genius. Her fragments inspired poets who sought to blend classical elegance with human emotion. Later, in the 19th and 20th centuries, her verses resonated with movements that sought to reclaim female voices from history. Writers and poets, particularly women, looked to Sappho as both inspiration and proof that female artistry had deep roots stretching back to the ancient world. The influence of Sappho is not just technical, her meter, imagery, and structure, but emotional. She demonstrated that poetry could capture the immediacy of love and loss, the shiver of desire, and the fragility of beauty. Later poets, who dared to focus on the personal, from the Romantics to modern lyricists, followed in the path she had carved. Thus, though her words survive only in fragments, her influence is whole. Sappho is part of the invisible scaffolding of world literature, a voice that poets across centuries have heard, even if only in echoes. Her legacy is proof that art does not vanish with time. It transforms, inspiring anew in every age. One of the most profound aspects of Sappho's legacy is the way her poetry speaks to female identity, in a world where women's voices were seldom heard. In archaic Greece, women were largely excluded from public life, their roles defined by domestic responsibilities and arranged marriages. Yet Sappho's verses broke through these confines, offering a glimpse into women's experiences, desires, and inner lives. She showed that the female perspective was not only valid, but also capable of producing some of the most enduring poetry of the ancient world. Her focus on love between women has made her an enduring figure in discussions of gender and sexuality. While male poets often wrote of desire directed toward boys or women from a distanced perspective, Sappho's verses brought a startling intimacy to the subject. She described the sensation of longing, the pang of jealousy, and the thrill of beauty with immediacy that made her readers, ancient and modern, feel as though they were overhearing a personal confession. This was revolutionary, to suggest that women's emotions and relationships were as worthy of art as any heroic battle. Later generations often struggled with this aspect of her work. Some ancient commentators attempted to downplay or erase the female-centered nature of her poetry, inventing tales of her passion for men to explain her verses. Yet despite these distortions, her identity as a poet who wrote powerfully about women's experiences endured. In modern times, this has made her a symbol of queer history, celebrated for giving voice to female desire in a way that transcends centuries of silence. Beyond sexuality, Sappho also reshaped what it meant to be a female artist. She proved that poetry was not only the domain of men, and that women could not only participate, but excel at the highest levels. Her work stands as a rare survival of a female perspective from antiquity, a reminder that even in societies where women were marginalized, they still found ways to create, to teach, and to leave lasting marks on culture. In Sappho's hands, female identity was not confined to silence or invisibility. It was expressed in song, in longing, in beauty, and in fragments that still speak today. Her poetry reminds us that the human heart, whether ancient or modern, male or female, beats with the same rhythms of desire and vulnerability. Sappho's voice, though preserved only in fragments, continues to echo across time. Few figures from antiquity embody the paradox of presence and absence as vividly as she does. On one hand, she was hailed as the 10th muse, praised by Plato, imitated by Roman poets, and canonized in the great library of Alexandria. On the other, the majority of her poetry has been lost, leaving us with incomplete verses, shattered pieces of a once great whole. And yet, even these fragments carry such power that they have secured her immortality. Her legacy is threefold: literary, cultural, and personal. Literarily, she reshaped the very boundaries of Greek poetry. By focusing on the intimate rather than the epic, she proved that the emotions of the heart could inspire works as lasting as tales of gods and heroes. This redefinition influenced generations of poets, from Catullus to Emily Dickinson, who drew from her style of lyric intensity. Culturally, she became a symbol whose meaning shifted across centuries. In antiquity, she was revered as the pinnacle of lyric poetry. In the Middle Ages, her reputation was clouded by rumor and misinterpretation, as later commentators struggled with her frank depictions of desire. In the modern era, she has been rediscovered as both a queer icon and a feminist precursor, her verses celebrated for voicing experiences that patriarchal traditions sought to suppress. Every age has found something new in Sappho, adapting her to its own struggles and aspirations. On a personal level, her fragments still move readers because they are raw, vulnerable, and timeless. When she writes of trembling at the sight of a beloved, or of the agony of absence, she strips human experience down to its essence. The fact that we can feel her emotions across a gulf of 26 centuries shows that some truths never age. Love, jealousy, longing, these remain as vivid today as in the sunlit courtyards of ancient Lesbos. Sappho's enduring legacy lies not in what was lost, but in what remains. Her incomplete verses are like broken statues. Even in ruin, they radiate beauty. She reminds us that art need not be whole to be eternal, and that the human heart, once captured in poetry, can outlast empires, religions, and entire civilizations. Though history has silenced many voices, Sappho still whispers, fragmentary, fragile, but indelible. Her words continue to stir hearts, proving that even in absence, presence can endure.